What the story that has been called one of history's greatest love affairs was never a love story at all. Cleopatra, Caesar, and Antony. Three figures whose relationships determined whether Rome would remain a republic. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
What later generations reduced to romance was in reality a set of cold calculations made by rulers who understood that the wrong alliance would cost them everything. Tonight, we turn to the political triangle between Cleopatra, Caesar, and Antony as the structural pivot between the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. The question is not who loved whom, but why each of these alliances was made, what each party needed from the other, and how the collapse of that triangle ended one world and built another.
To understand any of this, we need to understand the condition Egypt was in when Cleopatra came to power. The Ptolemaic kingdom had been in steady decline for generations. Rome had been interfering in Egyptian succession for over a century, propping up rulers who acknowledged Roman authority and removing those who did not. Egypt was formally independent but functionally a client state.
We are speaking about Cleopatra VII, Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony, and the geopolitical struggle that their alliances both reflected and accelerated.
What appeared to the ancient world and to later centuries as passion was, at its core, a series of negotiations between a kingdom fighting for survival and a republic tearing itself apart.
Then let us begin with the condition of Rome and Egypt in the years before Caesar arrived in Alexandria, and why that moment made the first alliance both inevitable and dangerous.
Rome in the 50s and 40s before the Common Era was not a stable republic. It was a state in which three men, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, had effectively divided power among themselves in what is known as the First Triumvirate. The republican institutions, the Senate, the consuls, the courts still existed, but they operated increasingly as theater around the real centers of power. When Crassus was killed at Carrhae in 53 before the Common Era, the balance collapsed. Caesar and Pompey moved toward confrontation. The civil war that followed was not a conflict between democracy and tyranny. It was a conflict between two men who had each concluded that the republic could not function without one of them controlling it.
So by the time Caesar arrived in Egypt, Rome was already functionally broken as a republic.
Exactly, and here is the first thing we need to correct. Caesar did not go to Egypt to find Cleopatra. He went to Egypt because Pompey had fled there after his defeat at Pharsalus in 48 before the Common Era, and Caesar was pursuing him. He arrived to find that Pompey had already been killed on the orders of the young king Ptolemy XIII, whose advisors had calculated that killing Caesar's enemy would earn Caesar's favor. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Caesar was furious. Pompey had been a Roman consul and general. His killing without trial by a foreign court was a violation Caesar chose to treat as an outrage rather than a convenience.
So Pompey's death actually opened the door for Caesar to become the decisive power in Egypt.
Yes, and Cleopatra understood this immediately. She had been exiled by her brother's faction and was camped at the Syrian border with a small army, unable to enter Alexandria. Caesar represented the single external force that could change the balance. She needed direct access to him before her brother's advisors could frame the situation in their favor. She arranged to be smuggled into the palace past her brother's guards, most likely wrapped in a large linen sack carried by a single trusted man. The story of the carpet is probably embellishment, but the core fact is well attested. She reached Caesar privately before her brother did. That access was the first move in what would become an extended strategic partnership.
So the famous entry was not theater for Caesar's amusement. It was a security operation.
Precisely. And what followed was not simply infatuation on Caesar's part. He had reasons of his own. Egypt's grain fed Rome. Its treasury was the largest in the Mediterranean world. A stable Egypt governed by a competent ruler aligned with Roman interests was worth more to Caesar than a destabilized Egypt governed by a faction of court advisors he did not control. Caesar supported Cleopatra's restoration. The Alexandrian War followed, a brutal urban conflict inside Alexandria itself, in which Caesar's forces, badly outnumbered, held the royal quarter while fighting off Ptolemy's army. Ptolemy XIII was defeated and drowned in the Nile in 47, before the Common Era. Cleopatra was restored as queen, nominally co-ruling with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, in keeping with Ptolemaic custom.
So Caesar fought a war inside an Egyptian city to restore a queen who served Rome's interests.
Yes, and Cleopatra bore Caesar a son shortly after, the child known as Caesarion. This is the moment where the personal and the political become completely inseparable. Caesarion was not only a child, he was a constitutional problem.
So the existence of Caesarion raised the question of what Rome would become after Caesar.
Exactly. Caesar had no legitimate male heir by his Roman wife. He had adopted his great-nephew Octavian in his will, but Caesarion existed as a biological son. If Caesar intended to establish a dynasty, a half-Ptolemaic heir would mean Rome and Egypt merging under a single ruling line. The Roman aristocracy had no framework for this and no appetite for it. The accusation that Caesar wanted to be king was already circulating. Cleopatra's presence in Rome gave that accusation a face. Caesar was killed on the 15th of March in 44 before the Common Era. Cleopatra was still in Rome. She returned to Egypt almost immediately, taking Caesarion with her. Within months, Ptolemy XIV was dead, almost certainly eliminated on her orders, and Caesarion was declared her co-ruler. She was consolidating her positions of sudden and total uncertainty.
So her response to Caesar's assassination was not grief but political action.
Yes, and this is the turning point. Rome dissolved into another civil war, this time between Caesar's assassins and his supporters. After the assassins were defeated at Philippi in 42 before the Common Era by Octavian and Mark Antony, the Roman world was divided between the two victors. Octavian took the west, Antony took the east, and the east meant dealing with Egypt. Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in 41, before the Common Era, to answer questions about whether Egypt had supported his enemies during the recent war. It was meant to be a demonstration of Roman authority. What actually happened was something else. Cleopatra arrived not as a summoned client queen, but as a sovereign putting on a display of Egyptian power and cultural magnificence that left little doubt about who was negotiating from strength.
So she turned a summons into an audience on her own terms.
Exactly. Antony needed what Egypt had. He was planning a massive campaign against Parthia, the one enemy Rome had never defeated, and that campaign required money, grain, and ships on a scale only Egypt could provide. Cleopatra needed what Antony had: military protection and Roman recognition of Caesarian status. The alliance was logical before it was anything else. Over the following years, Antony's eastern campaigns were supported extensively by Egyptian resources. He granted Cleopatra significant territorial additions, restoring Cyprus, parts of the Levantine coast, and other regions that had once been part of the old Ptolemaic Empire. In 34 before the Common Era, he staged the donations of Alexandria, a public ceremony in which he assigned sovereignty over vast eastern territories to Cleopatra and her children, and declared Caesarion to be the legitimate son of Julius Caesar.
So the donations of Alexandria were not just a gift, they were a rival vision of how the Mediterranean should be governed.
Precisely, and Octavian seized on them immediately. The donations gave him everything he needed. Antony was publicly distributing Roman territory to a foreign queen, and legitimizing a half-Egyptian child as Caesar's true heir, which directly threatened Octavian's own position as Caesar's adopted son and political successor. What followed was one of the most effective propaganda campaigns in ancient history. Octavian did not declare war on Antony, which would have divided Roman opinion. He declared war on Cleopatra alone. By making her the enemy, he turned the coming conflict into a patriotic defense of Rome against an eastern foreign queen who had corrupted and enslaved a Roman general. Antony became a victim in this framing, or a traitor depending on the audience.
So Octavian used Cleopatra as a rhetorical device to avoid calling the war what it actually was: another Roman civil war.
Yes. He also seized and read publicly the will Antony had deposited with the Vestal Virgins, an act of profound legal violation, because the will reportedly contained provisions for burial in Alexandria and grants to his children by Cleopatra. Whether the will was genuine, altered, or fabricated entirely is unknown. What is certain is that its public reading destroyed Antony's reputation in Rome. The decisive battle came at Actium on the 2nd of September in 31 before the Common Era. The confrontation was primarily naval. Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet faced Octavian's forces under the command of Marcus Agrippa. The details of what happened remain disputed. What is established is that Cleopatra's squadron withdrew through a gap in the fighting. Antony followed her, and that the remaining fleet, leaderless and uncertain, surrendered or dispersed.
So Actium was not a straightforward military defeat, it was a collapse.
Yes, and what followed confirmed it. Antony's land forces in Greece deserted when news of the naval outcome spread. He and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria. Over the following months, his remaining allies defected one by one. Octavian advanced without serious resistance. When he reached Alexandria in 30 before the Common Era, Antony's forces dissolved almost immediately. Antony ended his life under the false belief that Cleopatra had already ended hers. She had not. She survived him by several days, negotiating with Octavian, attempting to understand what terms he might offer. When it became clear that he intended to display her in his triumph in Rome, she ended her life on her own terms. Most ancient sources say by snakebite, though the exact method is not certain.
So, to the very end, she was making calculations. She chose the manner of her death rather than allow Octavian to choose it for her.
Exactly. Caesarion was hunted down and killed shortly after. He was 17. With his death, the last biological link between the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Julian line was severed. Egypt became a Roman province, personally administered by a prefect appointed by Octavian, too valuable to be entrusted to any senator who might use it as a base of power. There is another dimension of the Caesar and Cleopatra relationship that tends to be overlooked. Caesar spent roughly 9 months in Egypt, an extraordinarily long time given the pressures he faced elsewhere in the Roman world. Part of that time was consumed by the Alexandrian War, but not all of it. He and Cleopatra traveled together along the Nile, and ancient sources describe him as fascinated by Egyptian intellectual culture, its astronomy, its philosophy, its libraries.
Though the encounter was not only political, Egypt changed how Caesar understood power and civilization.
Yes. The calendar reform he introduced in Rome in 45 before the Common Era, the Julian calendar that structured Western timekeeping for over 15 centuries, was directly based on Egyptian astronomical knowledge. The practical consequences of that 9 months in Alexandria extended across millennia. Tactical consequences of that 9 months in Alexandria. Antony's relationship with Egypt was similarly transformative in ways that went beyond the military alliance. He spent extended periods in Alexandria, where he adopted aspects of Ptolemaic court culture, the ceremonies, the festivals, the language of divine kingship. Roman observers who visited him reported what they described as a man who had gone native, but this was partly Octavian's framing. Antony was also a skilled general conducting Eastern policy, in a context where Egyptian ceremonial language was politically effective.
So what Rome read as corruption was partly Antony adapting to the political culture of the territory he governed.
Exactly, and this ambiguity was precisely what made Octavian's propaganda so powerful. He did not need to prove that Antony had abandoned Rome, he only needed to make the question plausible. Once Roman audiences began asking whether Antony was still Roman, the answer almost did not matter. The doubt itself was sufficient. Cleopatra's own position throughout this period was one of constant recalculation. She was not simply responding to Roman events, she was attempting to shape them. Her support for Antony was real, but it was also a calculation that a Roman East under Antony's authority, with Egypt as its anchor, was preferable to a unified Roman world under Octavian where Egypt would be absorbed entirely.
So her strategic error was not miscalculating Octavian's ambition, but underestimating how completely he would consolidate power after Actium.
Precisely. Few people in 31 before the Common Era could have predicted that Octavian would manage Rome for another 44 years, outliving his rivals, and rebuilding every institution of government around his own authority. The durability of what he built was not obvious in advance.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret. Margaret, for those who want to understand how these alliances actually functioned, what drove them and what destroyed them, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Cleopatra, A Life by Stacy Schiff.
So this is a book that recovers the political intelligence behind the legend.
Exactly. Schiff offers a critical reassessment of Cleopatra's reign, separating romantic legend from political strategy. She situates the alliances with Caesar and Antony within the broader struggle for Mediterranean dominance, emphasizing diplomatic calculation, economic power, and Roman propaganda, and showing how her defeat marked the consolidation of Octavian's imperial authority.
Is it accessible to someone coming to this history for the first time?
Schiff is a biographer first, and her prose moves with considerable clarity. She is also honest about what the ancient sources distort and what they omit. A reader with no prior knowledge of Rome or Egypt will be able to follow her argument without difficulty.
Zoe gives the reader not only Cleopatra's story, but a lesson in how the victors of history construct the villains they need.
That is precisely what makes it essential reading. The book asks you to notice the gap between what Octavian needed people to believe and what the evidence actually supports.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The immediate consequence of Actium and Cleopatra's death was the transformation of Roman governance itself. Octavian returned to Rome, accepted the title Augustus in 27 before the Common Era, and established a political system that maintained the outward forms of the Republic while concentrating effective power in a single office. He had learned from Caesar's mistake. Caesar had reached too openly for monarchy. Augustus created monarchy while insisting it was something else. The propaganda against Cleopatra did not end with her death, it intensified. Roman poets and historians working within the Augustan cultural program reinforced the image of a dangerous foreign seductress who had nearly corrupted the Roman state. This was not incidental. The legitimacy of Augustus's rule, rested partly on the story that he had saved Rome from exactly that threat.
So the myth of Cleopatra as seductress was not just a distortion. It was a political necessity for the regime that followed her.
Exactly, and this is why the historical recovery of the real Cleopatra matters. Every generation that accepted the Augustan version was also accepting the Augustan justification for imperial rule. The propaganda and the history were inseparable. Caesar's role in this longer story is also worth examining carefully. He did not go to Egypt to build an empire, he went to finish a civil war. But his time in Alexandria seems to have clarified for him what kind of authority he wanted to hold. The model of the Ptolemaic divine ruler, the king as living god, was present and visible in everything Egypt projected. Caesar returned to Rome with a different sense of what personal power could look like.
So Egypt influenced Caesar's political imagination in ways that contributed to the fear that got him killed.
Yes, and Antony went even further in that direction. His identification with the god Dionysus, his adoption of Eastern ceremonial practices, his granting of quasi-royal honors to Cleopatra and their children, all of this was read in Rome as evidence that he had abandoned Roman identity entirely. Whether he had, or whether he was simply operating within the political culture of the Eastern Mediterranean, remains debated. What is not debated is the structural result. Each relationship accelerated the erosion of republican norms. On earth. Caesar's dictatorship, the civil wars that followed his death, Antony's Eastern turn, Octavian's propaganda war, each of these was a step toward a system of government Rome had officially rejected, but was structurally moving toward regardless.
So the triangle was not just about three people, it was the mechanism through which Rome transitioned from republic to empire.
Precisely, and Cleopatra's position in that mechanism was not peripheral. She was the variable that made the transition visible. Her existence forced Rome to confront questions it had been avoiding: what succession meant, where sovereignty resided, whether the Mediterranean world could be governed by a republic, or required something more concentrated. The enduring relevance of this story lies in what it reveals about how great powers managed the transition from one political form to another. Rome did not become an empire because Augustus was ambitious. It became an empire because the Republic had failed to solve the problems that its own expansion had created. Cleopatra and Egypt were a mirror in which those failures were reflected most clearly.
So Egypt was not only Rome's adversary, it was Rome's diagnosis.
Yes, and in that sense the story of Cleopatra, Caesar, and Antony is not a story about the ancient world that has grown distant. It is a story about what happens when political institutions can no longer contain the power they have created, and three individuals, each brilliant in their own way, are left to navigate the consequences. The modern parallel is not difficult to find. When institutional structures weaken, individuals fill the vacuum. When they fill the vacuum, the question of whose individual will prevails becomes the central political question. Rome answered that question with Augustus. The answer lasted 5 centuries, but it cost the Republic its existence. And it cost Cleopatra and Caesarion their lives.
So the love triangle that history remembers was actually a power vacuum that 3 exceptional people tried to fill, and only one survived to shape how the others would be remembered.
Exactly, and that survivor wrote the history, which is perhaps the most important lesson the story has to offer.
Thank you for staying with us tonight, and thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the political logic of 3 alliances that remade the ancient world.
What Cleopatra, Caesar, and Antony understood, and what Octavian proved, is that in a world without stable institutions, the most dangerous thing a person can possess is the ability to make others believe they are indispensable. I'm not sure.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.